Yes, hello and welcome. Thank you, Christian. And welcome to our panel entitled, as you can see from the program, Big Problems, Big Data, Little Privacy, Ethics of Data Use in Development Contexts. Yes, my name is David, as Christian just kindly introduced me, and I work for the Vodafone Institute. You might wonder what that is. The Vodafone Institute is the think tank for Vodafone, based here in Berlin, and it's our privilege to be one of the supporters of this year's Global Innovation Gathering alongside GIZ and the German Ministry for Development. Before I will hand over to our panel, let me just very briefly introduce the topic and why we think it is important. If you include the term big data in the title of any event or discussion nowadays, you always run the risk of boring your audience. It seems as if everything has been said about big data, and big data is not only a buzzword, it really seems as if it has lost its fashionable appeal or its miraculous aura. But we think that this might just be the right moment to have a new and a sober look at the potential, but also, of course, the challenges and risks connected with big data, particularly in a developing context. I mean, is it really only a hype? Well, if you look at data, big data, being generated through mobile phones, it's actually still a very new and still a fast-growing phenomenon. If you compare mobile phone data being generated in 2009 with the amount of data predicted for 2017, it's actually multiplied by the factor of 100. So we are still at the very beginning of that process. And if you look at mobile broadband subscriptions in Africa, there were 105 million subscriptions in 2013, and for 2018, it's predicted that there will be 805 million. So really a rapid growth, and I think we are really still at the very beginning of that process. So we think big data is certainly more than a hype. You all know that analogy that you can hear very often, that big data is the oil of the 21st century. But what does that mean for Africa? What does it mean for inequality of wealth and income? And what does it mean for the fight against poverty? It has been claimed in the past that big data might be at least part of the solution of Africa's statistical tragedy, as it has been described before. What is the statistical tragedy in Africa? Well, we do still have rather bad poverty data, unreliable information. Many researchers don't really know what is happening on the ground. And of course, in the past, it was always very costly and very difficult to get data. It's expensive and hard and difficult to collect. Now, you don't really need a smartphone. You can actually gather very valuable and interesting data with basic phones, the so-called CDR, the call detail record. So where is the person that is doing a call? Whom does that person call and for how long? And based on these data, you can do a lot of things. You can, for example, predict what will happen based on past patterns in terms of predicting the spread of diseases. Jan will talk about that in a minute. You can also get real-time information about human actions and behaviors. You can get real-time feedback also on intervention. So when we do X, what will happen next? So instead of having lengthy and expensive evaluations, you might just look at the very instant of an intervention. So that really also fundamentally changes social research and research in the development context. You can also really have a new form of poverty measures from cell phone use, because people of different income and different background have different patterns of using their phone. So you can see where people are moving and about their income structure and so on. But I won't really go into all the details what is possible. We'll learn about that and other aspects in a minute. But of course, we do not only want to celebrate all these great solutions, we also want to address the ethical problems and challenges that we are facing at the moment. And I think it can be said that we do lack a conceptual, a legal, and an ethical framework that lays out the principles of how to make use of the data, particularly in emerging markets and developing countries. Who owns these data? Who can access these data? And do big problems, do urgent problems justify interventions which might push privacy protection to the background? And how can we make sure that the people's data will actually benefit the people and not only the big players and the big corporations? And why is it the case that, of course, many of these applications happen in developing countries because there are no strong privacy protection laws in place. It's a bit of a dilemma. It opens a lot of opportunities. But the reason for that is that in the end it's not ideal really for the user or for the customer because he doesn't have the privacy protection in place that we have here in Europe or in other countries. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to Jan, who will be the first. We thought we have a little bit of a debate-style panel here, so Jan will be the proponent, and then Zara will carry on, and she will be the opponent, and then we just join the discussion. Jan. Please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's actually a pleasure to see a pretty good number of people here. And we talk about big data, so we can say a lot of things. And I've been concerned about the number of people attending each session at Republica. And I've been just running a very complex algorithm. And I noticed there is a strong correlation between the people in the room and the number of Kenyan ladies in a panel, right? So I hope it's going to be fun today again. So yeah, I'm going to talk about a few applications of big data in the development context. Development, like we say. I've been working for the team of CTIC Dakar, which is a technology business incubator based in Senegal. We are public-private partnerships, so we have different type of partners, including telecommunication operators. And so we had the great opportunity to do a challenge with the telecommunication operator Orange to see what could be the potential of big data in a development context. Just to know you a little better, who is in the room has a scientific background? Can you raise your hand, please, if you have a scientific background? Okay. Who has an art background in here? Cool. Who has a literature background? And who has business background? Okay, cool. Just to let you know, I'm going to have very scientific slides. It's just to impress you a little bit. It's not because I'm a scientist, don't worry. So what is this other stuff for development? You know what I mean? The challenge is called big data or data for development. We see a lot of things for development, blah, blah, blah. And why, when it always has to deal with Africa, it has to be for development. So that's maybe another question we will ask, but just letting you know about this challenge that we run with Orange. So Orange basically is one of the largest telecommunication operator in Africa, and also has a huge monopoly in Senegal. And for one time in having a monopoly, could be interesting. It's when they open their data. Just to let you know, Orange owns for 70% of the market in Senegal in terms of voice communication. So it's pretty big. And so they just opened for the research community 3 data sets. So different data about the mobility of their users, different data about the localization of those, and also the length of the call, the duration of the call, and all those kind of things. And of course, they put all the data that they already have, that they naturally collect for make your invoice. And they anonymized it. And we're going to talk again about that, the anonymization. Sorry for my English. I don't know what you say in English. This part is very complicated. So that's why, we've been working pretty hard on that. And so we help them, reach out to the research community in Senegal, and also globally. So we used the data from Senegal, but open to the entire worldwide research community. So you have 260 research labs working on that, including 11 from Senegal. And it's going to be another question we're going to raise, is the ownership of this science, and that has to be in emerging countries if you use the data that we have in emerging countries. And after a few months of research, actually it was a year-long program, we had 60 papers submitted, scientific papers submitted. 40% of them were talking about transport, 20% of them were talking about healthcare, and others about national statistics. So I'm just going to share a few of them and what could be the potential application. Yeah, I told you I had a very scientific slide, right? It looks cool, huh? So I'm not going to get into detail for that. So it's an university in Asia. Basically, you can see the title, How Can We Use Mobile Data to Anticipate the Spread of the Ebola Disease? Ebola disease has been huge in Africa. We talk a lot about this. but also science and data can really help us predict how this is going to spread. Just simply by looking at how the people use the cell phone and where they are at different points can help you, in case of a disease, predict the spread of that. We've been very lucky in Senegal. We only had one case. But this kind of thing really helped, I think, and can help further in the future. Another use for electrification. I mean, all of you, if you've been in Africa, you have power shutdown. That's a huge problem. And this kind of thing, enables to understand the pattern of the way people use the cell phone, move from different cities, to anticipate how you can better make a system for electricity. And this is very, very important. And why all this thing is very important is because we have no data so far. It's not like in Europe or in the US where our government have the means to do this data, this huge survey on everything. If you go to Senegal, because I don't really know the other country, but at least in Senegal, we have none of that. And that's a real challenge, because if you don't have any data, how can you plan relevant urbanism, electrification, healthcare programs? And so this is why that could be interesting. So another example, then it's going to be the electrification. Another one, again and again, on healthcare, is the predictive malaria prevalence. So you all know malaria is a very huge problem in Africa. And so just, again, looking at how the people move from different cities, you can predict. And this is about different regions. So let's say, take an example here. If you have a big malaria prevalence in this region, you can expect this kind of spread throughout the entire region. And they did that for all the 10th region of Senegal. Yep. And this is a paper from Brown University. So it's all university from all over the world, and sometimes involving Senegalese researchers, and not enough. A last one that I found pretty cool, because this traffic jam is huge in most urban areas all over the continent, and Dakar as well. So you see, this is Dakar. So this is where 2 million people work every day, but there is only here 200,000 inhabitants. And so you have all these people commuting every day over here, and so they build a beautiful highway. They spend a lot of donors' money into building this highway, expecting that it's going to have a huge impact. And this actually data is very interesting because it shows that, yes, it has. You see in blue the part of the city that are less blocked by traffic jam, which is a good point because in some point it works really well. But surprisingly, there is a part here in the city, we don't know exactly why, that is completely more packed than it used to be. And it's kind of something that is not, obvious at all. And so it's only with this data that we can look at that. And of course, after, maybe the government can take decision to build another highway or something like this. And so there was a paper from London School of Economics. Yep. And for the rest, I have my PayPal account. You can send me the money over here. No, of course not. It's free and everything is downloadable from the Orange website, d40.orange.com. There is 60 research papers that have been published over there, so you can definitely look at them and go through. It's pretty heavy, it's pretty dense if you don't have any scientific background, but it's very, very interesting. And we can just imagine if we do that for all of the countries, the impact it can have. Something that is interesting is only about 1 year of mobile data, to year 2013. And the challenge, of course, is to do that on a real time. But that also poses other questions that we'll probably debate after that. So I'd like to come up with a few suggestions. Because we are a third-party organizer as an incubator, we reach out a lot to the startup, the research community, but also the public stakeholders. And I think this is very, very important. If you want to have a successful big data project in a development context, you need to involve the people on the ground. Because you need to build sustainable businesses at the end. You need to have research who are locally understanding the problematic. The issue, if you have a researcher from MIT and Stanford working on this project, that's great. They have a great scientific background. But do they understand your local background? And what they want to prove with their research, is it what you really need as a Senegalese people? And that's pretty interesting. So respect the privacy laws, if they exist, Senegal passed a law like a year ago. It's still not very much enforced. So they created this commission for data privacy. So it's a big challenge because, we're going to discuss about it. It's pretty hard in most African countries, don't have laws enforcing data privacy. And you have to involve the ecosystem. You have to connect the researchers and the resource that you find locally to international knowledge and capacity, notably when you need supercomputer and people who are able to build very solid algorithms. But you also need to reinforce the local capacity in this sense. And of course, after, to build sustainable businesses. And this is really what interests us as a business incubator, is maybe out of the 660 paper, if we can have 1 or 2 startups really building products that could be used locally and maybe open sourced or different kind of model, that could be great. So, and I just came out with that this morning. So I'm going to call that the Rick Rub rules of big data, right? So it's copyrighted. You can now use it. But I just wanted to raise a question for you and maybe to open to the discussion. Because I'm not sure, if data is the best way to predict the future and to build a future. Because data is all about the past, right? It's using what you have seen in the years before to build what could be your future. Could be interesting, but don't we need, maybe, especially in Senegal, don't we need like disruptive technology and then disruptive innovation that you cannot predict with the past data? So I just want to let you with this question around big data. Of course, there is the ethics problem, but there is also just the use of that. Is it relevant? Well, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Yeah. Thank you, Jan. Okay, so that seems to be all pretty easy, straightforward. Great solutions and already a framework. Thanks so much. But also there are, of course, challenges, problems, maybe unintended consequences, and this is what Zara will talk about.
Yeah, hi everyone, thanks for having me. So there were lots of actually things that Jan said that I want to pick up on, but just before I do, I think it's kind of important to define what we think of when we say big data, because lots of people have very different understandings and it makes this conversation kind of difficult to have. So when we say big data, we don't mean open data. That's data that's in a certain format that falls under what's known as the open definition. Means it's machine readable, it means it's downloadable, it means you can do what you want with it. And when we talk about big data, we mean massive quantities of data. So data that can't be dealt with in the same way that has been done in the past. And extremely large data sets, you can, as Jan was explaining, you can analyze them to find out all sorts of things about human interaction and about human behavior and patterns and trends and that kinds of thing. So it's the kind of thing that's going to happen. It's going to become even bigger and bigger as time goes on, because as we all know, we're leaking data all over the place, as time goes on. So challenges around big data can be anything from the way that companies think of it as like how to capture enough or how to analyze it correctly. And what I'm going to talk about is specific to the field of international development. So I think the biggest question here is who, in lots of ways. So who is collecting the data? And who is deciding what they do with it. So one of the points that Jan just made, saying respect privacy laws if they exist, I actually wholly disagree with if they exist. I don't think you need a privacy law in a certain country to be able to respect privacy as a fundamental human right, because everyone is human, whether they happen to live in a country that has a strong... whether they happen to have a strong, whether they happen to have strong privacy legislation or not. And this is something that really worries me in lots of the discussions that I have in this field, because people say, oh, isn't it great that in various African countries and various Asian countries, there's very weak legislation, and that means we can go and we can get all these insights and we can learn all these things. And it just reminds me of, I talked yesterday about the role of technology in colonialism. And that power disparity is completely that. It's poor people in poor countries without the legislation to protect them, and rich people coming and saying, oh, we want to learn all these things about you, and then we'll use it to help you. But for example, the 60 papers that were written, I wonder how many Senegalese people read any of those, to be honest. And the 4 examples that you showed, none of them were by Senegalese researchers, although I know some of them were. And like putting that knowledge in academic papers is great for people from academic institutions. It's less great for the people who the data is being collected about. I mean, there are lots of kind of very noble-sounding efforts around collecting data on really, really problematic issues like human trafficking, for example. Like Google have this initiative with Palantir, a partnership working on human trafficking and trying to. Palantir are a company based in the US that work on that are one of the big. They have one of the biggest data mining, data analytics companies in the entire world. And then, so they have this Google Palantir company partnership working on human trafficking, trying to work out, where things are going, what's going on, what patterns there are. But Palantir started as a CIA-funded startup. Like, when we think about, it's great, it's very noble, it's wonderful, but this is all data that will be eventually somehow going to the CIA because they're the ones who started it. And that's another thing that is very worrying, and lots of these partnerships and lots of these initiatives, because there are companies who are in some way, the companies who have the technology to be able to do lots of these big data or even just normal data projects are in some way linked to the US, in some way to Europe. They're very, very rarely, but increasingly so, which is wonderful, actually based in the countries that they're doing the research on. And that means that in many cases, if the money's coming from different sources, it depends where it's coming from. If it's coming from, US aid, the US government's development arm have been involved in CIA operations. So when we're saying, isn't it great, we're collecting all this data and we're going to help eradicate poverty, no, you're giving data to the CIA. That's not something that we want to be involved in. It's not something that should be labeled as international development in any way. And then thinking about who the data is being collected from. So we have lots of these issues of consent in Europe, in North America. And it's something we talk about. We have terms and conditions, none of us read them, we tick them, and that's something that we're concerned about. In lots of these cases, there aren't even any terms and conditions to consider. It's telecommunications companies collecting data without anyone knowing and having no option to opt out of those. So with, for example, thinking about if someone wants to use a mobile phone in their country to make a phone call, to connect with their family, again, information is also fundamentally a human right too. And if they don't have any option to opt out from their data then being given from a telecommunications company to another government to a company, that's not really informed consent. That's kind of the opposite. That's doing it without them ever knowing. And it's wonderful that there's kind of arguments against that, saying it's only metadata. That doesn't mean a thing. You can do just as much as bad stuff as you can do with metadata as you can with the actual kind of transcripts of phone calls. I guess, there's lots of issues around who and agency within this. I would argue that, in lots of these cases, people don't have a choice, and they should. We do seem to be treating people in poor countries with lots of these big data projects as though they're second-class citizens, as though they don't have human rights. And when we have the same conversations here in Europe, we think about them in very different ways. You can see that in lots of things in international development generally. An example is in the UK, we rejected the idea of identification cards because it's against, our privacy rights. But the UK is currently funding identification cards in 3 or 4 countries worldwide. But, double standards, it's fine. It's an international development project, so it seems to be okay in that way, which is something I also disagree with. So just as an example, there's, I think with lots of these projects, we seem to think of them as what's the best possible outcome that could come from all this data? So, when we're designing projects, in the NGO world, we often use what's called a theory of change. So it says, this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens, and then this happens, and then this really good thing happens. And we only think of them in the best possible way. And a former colleague of mine has this idea of creating dystopian theories of change instead of utopian ones. So you think of what's the worst possible thing that could, it's kind of depressing, I'm sorry. You think of the worst possible thing that could happen with every single stage of your project. And I think in lots of these projects, if we were to do that, it would terrify us, and it would be really, really, really awful. So just to give an example of that, this is a quote from an Al Arabiya article earlier this year from someone who's helping run a refugee camp in Turkey. It says that biometrics IDs will be used for lots of good things: aid, job opportunities, education, social opportunities. but also to identify those who have been involved in criminal activity. And I mentioned this already because I just think it's a great example of what I mean by the worst possible things that could be done with this data. I mean, who decides who is a criminal? The Turkish government, the Syrian government, the US government? What do they do with that? Do you have any choice when you arrive at that refugee camp? If you know that you're considered to be a criminal for something that's actually totally within your human rights, do you then walk away from the refugee camp and go somewhere else? Like, do you even have that opportunity to make that decision? Or are you just faced with like, I'm going to have to do it if I want food, shelter, and water, which is a terrible choice that no one should ever have to make. And then another one is, so this is a tweet that was from a meeting that was held a couple of weeks ago about the data revolution. So in international development, we're coming to the end of the Millennium Development Goals 2015, and we're now coming up with the Sustainable Development Goals. And one big part of the Sustainable Development Goals is been around collecting data and using data to make sure that the Sustainable Development Goals happen as we've said they would do. And yeah, so this is something that, so asking US government intelligence systems to be used as part of the Sustainable Development Goals. And the double standards there are just so huge. Like when the US government use that intelligence on US citizens, it's terrible. But when we use those systems to help other poor people, it's great. Like it blows my mind. So just a last thing. So basically, I don't want it to seem like I'm kind of anti-innovation, because I'm not. It's just, and this is kind of often the way that I see the argument framed, like between innovation and conservatism, or being really slow and bureaucratic. And I don't think that's the argument. I don't think that's the dichotomy we should be dealing with at all. I think we should just be being thoughtful, thinking of all possibilities, and not being overly utopian in what we're imagining will happen with the data. Just being like, I think we have this issue of, we have this idea of innovation being very quick, rapid iterations, and that's great in like a purely software environment, agile development, that kind of thing. But in this, we're dealing with huge amounts of like people who are in the most vulnerable positions in the entire world. Like, it's not like this is an experiment that we can just try. If it doesn't work, try again. If it doesn't work, try again. This is a totally different situation, and I think it requires even more care than we might necessarily do. And given that, we seem to be going the other way, thinking, oh, they don't have any laws, like I'm, legally okay. We shouldn't be abiding by the lowest common denominator of, oh, this government hasn't caught up with their privacy legislation, let's go there. Okay. That's it. Thanks.
Cool. Thank you, Zara. Just to keep it between the two of you for a second, I mean, I can totally see, very legitimate concerns that you've just expressed. I just wonder what you think should be done now. I mean, given the fact that, we do not really have privacy laws in place, but we are facing that dilemma that the data is there and that we should make use of it in order to solve immediate problems.
I'm not sure we should make use of it. I mean, I'm not sure we should make use. I mean, there's lots of things within that. So, like what you're saying about anonymization being a huge problem, I think maybe for just taking that as an example, like, yeah, you might anonymize the data that you're making available right now, but that's not the only data set in the world about that population. So, I mean, anonymization is going to become even ever more difficult to actually do. De-anonymization is totally possible. So I'm not sure we should think of it as like, oh, we should use this because it's there. Just because it's possible doesn't mean we need to do it.
Okay, do you share that view? I mean, one could also say if there is a problem that can be solved, it's an urgent problem. We talk about the spread of disease and so on, and we do not make use of it. It's also it's an ethical problem. Isn't
I really agree with you, Sarah. Maybe looking at different emergency case where we really have to maybe to put a framework in this case of emergency to use this data. But I agree, if there is no laws to protect the citizen, why should we urge, and run into using those big data? That may be a little too early. Mm-hmm. And I think we have to be very careful. But also the question I ask is that will we always need, those laws? Can we couldn't we find other type of framework outside of laws to protect the citizen? Maybe it's going to be like independent ethic panels, could be like different type of peer watching or this kind of thing. I don't know. I'm just thinking as I speak, but I think, you know, if we wait for the laws to be applied, but also after, you know, passed and enforced, that's two different stages.
Yeah,
and sometimes we
totally
pass so many laws that are not enforced. So maybe we should like find other way to be able to use those data.
Yeah, I totally agree. But I think, I mean, I feel like data is thrown at a problem quite a lot as like, oh, there's this problem, we need to solve it. When actually, like, if we really cared about the spread of disease in African countries, we'd sort out pharmaceutical companies and patents. Like, if we're in a rich country and we really care about that, we would make sure that medicines were available for them to use. We wouldn't start analyzing data about a certain population. That's
true. And you know what? We have to bear in mind as well that data is only a reflection of what happened. Mm-hmm. And I mean, after it's what you build on that matters, you know, and whatever data and big graph that you have, you know, what really matters, what do you do with that, right? Mm-hmm. And if we still have, you know, the same and useless program, we're not going to be useful to have those data, so I completely agree with you.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, data isn't just a reflection of what happens there, it's a reflection of whoever's collecting it and how it's being collected. Like, no data is neutral. It's got biases in it, and we need to understand that when we're analyzing it. And that's kind of why it's a problem that, you know, not many people who come from that culture or that country are involved in analyzing it and drawing those trends and drawing those conclusions, because it might mean something completely different on paper to what we think it does. And I think, we have this understanding of, like, if it's in a spreadsheet, it's neutral, it doesn't have any biases, and that's completely false.
You also, sorry if I may just hand over to you. You also work quite a lot on, you know, the relationship between digitization, general terms, and policy making. What is your take on that?
So I'm caught somewhere in between the two. I mean, they both make very valid points. And because this is an unfolding phenomenon, I think for me, the thing that always makes me chuckle is this rush to quantify Africa. And so it's the new scramble and petition of Africa through data. And so anything that looks like a data set is going to be overanalyzed and under-contextualized to make sense of how Africa tweets or how Africa moves, you know, mobility or whatever. And what people don't factor in, and I'll use a very fantastic example from the Kibera slum in Nairobi. Some well-meaning research, I think, from the US gave women some tracking devices to see how quickly they got to places to get water and back, and was trying to help them minimize the time they spent moving from their homes to where they go get the water. Now, I can't even remember what the research question or solution was, but it was this quest to also save Africa from itself. The thing this wonderful, well-meaning researcher that didn't factor in is every day those women went out, they took a different route to go and come back. What he didn't factor in, and this is what I want to introduce to this conversation, is the social element. So today, these women want to visit their neighbors, catch on the gossip of this side of the slum, the news from the other side of the slum, some business in the middle part. And so this person ended up with a completely random data set. Their conclusion was that these people are cray-cray. They don't want to be helped. But what this person didn't factor in is the context. And this is where I'm coming in from with this angle. And what we are trying to do, at least with some of the research we're doing, is bringing that context. It's while the data is being generated, and in this case, social media data, assessing how people are conversing about different issues. Say, whether it's a voting process. I mean, in Kenya, for instance, in 2013, we had an election that was under this guise of peace at all costs. And so there was a lot of self-censorship that was being imposed. So media could only talk about things going well. Everybody was in this quest to talk about how we were a peaceful nation. We were putting on a show for the world because we were coming back from a context where in 2007, things had gone a bit south. Now, we asked ourselves the question, as Kenyans, we know something is off about this narrative. Let's go to the new place where people are trying to have conversations or beaming their thoughts to the world, and this was social media. More specifically, we looked at Twitter data, and we looked at what people were doing in terms of sharing about their experience during the voting process, and we found a hell other story that nobody else was picking up on. So in this case, the question becomes, do we ignore that data because it's there? And that's why in this whole narrative, I don't know where to fall, is we found so much insight. We found that people were not everybody was buying into, Kenya was voting so peacefully. Not everybody was willing to suppress the social tensions that were at play at that time. Even with ongoing work we have around monitoring online hate speech in Kenya, in Nigeria, in South Sudan, and even in Myanmar. One of the things we're learning is the need for context. So I may have been the person who has been tasked with initiating the project, but when it comes to another country context, I have no business trying to assume that I'll figure it out. And I need other people who are from that context to do that work themselves. And this is super important for anybody who's going to be funding this work, anybody who's going to say they want to rush to quantify Africa to D for D Africa, I for D, and whatever for D Africa. You need to, without the context, you're going to end up like that well-meaning researcher in Kibera who concluded that Africans of Kibera were crazy, because we need to factor in context. Now, that also means that we should not blindly look at data without looking at what other events are happening. And this is the other risk that we face. The world is not homogeneous, There's this other fascination with collecting data to predict events, to predict outcomes. I'm like, but humans don't just operate like that, We're not just like bots, unless that's what we're aiming towards. I mean, there's vested interest in an Orwellian state, but until then, there's context that is super important. And this is where, I guess in this whole debate, it becomes a bit fluid. There's the other aspect of laws being formulated, not necessarily to protect citizens, but to protect those people who are gaining access to this data, and especially the private companies. So do we still pursue the angle of talking about the laws, or do we make sure that human rights or social science and context is being picked up on? So I guess it's a gray area, but my point, again, my takeaway point, let's not be too quick to be in a rush to quantify contexts. There's so much more that goes into it.
I mean, I would really be interested, what is your impression at the moment? Do you have a privacy debate at all in the country you come from? I mean, what is it? What, do you have different concepts of privacy? Is it as a lively debate as it is elsewhere?
Right. So, I mean, with the research we do, the sort of like departure point becomes people who sign up to use social media, people who sign up to use Twitter, people who sign up to use Facebook, or at least public spaces on the internet. The terms and services and the terms of service that nobody ever reads, that's a whole other conversation for another day. We need to talk about that. But we work with the premise that, people are aware of what they're signing up for. They're going into a new public space. It's a new public sphere, so to speak. And so we will never touch on anything that is in a private domain. We will never go into monitoring how hate is spread through WhatsApp or Viber or anything like that. We use that which is in the public domain and operate within that context. That said, with the big data that we end up with, we also are learning and also advocating the notion that big data does not necessarily have to be open. There's a whole thing, there's this false notion that, all data should be open. How we aggregate that data, and it goes back to what Zahra was saying, data is not neutral. So when we collect data to assess hate speech, we've collected it with certain assumptions, we've collected with a certain set of questions. So we can't just put it out there for anybody to pick up, because it could falsely, lead to somebody being, attacked or being picked up on by authorities and that kind of thing. So how we work around the issue of privacy is we have the responsibility to assess that data, make sense of it, make social sense of it, and very much inform the conversations that are going into the notion of how citizens, at least in this case, Kenyan citizens, are using the online sphere. But we cannot present that data to just about anybody without a proper agreement that, this will not be used to falsely, prosecute somebody because there's the responsibility we have to protect that data. The conversation of privacy, I guess it goes back to when you're going online, are you aware of what you're doing? It goes back to the individual, and that is a function of education and awareness around that. Yeah.
Thank you. I would like to hand over to you, Sheila. Yes. You had so many mobile entrepreneurs pitching with their ideas, and many of them are certainly involve some kind of data analytics or making use of data. Well, what is your take on that topic?
Just before I comment on that, I have 2 points that I feel I must mention. So I think for most people, the context you have on big data is completely different. How big data is looked at by most people elsewhere is the project, like Nanjira said, to help others. While as for most of the African countries, how we look at it is not really about data. It's about services. Then after that, you think about, oh, but I'm also giving these guys data. So it's actually a context thing. And that's why I agree with what Zara was saying. Exploiting such people is very easy because one, there's no regulation, and two, they don't really care. So for you, you just come in there, you're like, I want to go to Kibera. Those women were probably given, what, 1,000 shillings? And they're like, yeah, give me 5. I'll wear all of those things. So we have bigger problems to think about than big data, such that it makes us very vulnerable to the outside that looks at it as projects, as sources of funding, and as options to set organizations in Africa. Well, my take. Anyway. So for the developers, I think they sort of have a similar mindset. To them, they're trying to provide solutions to urgent problems in their societies. What the data will do will come after the problems are solved. And most of them, I think IHAB Research has done research on this. They asked them, do you do analytics of the data? What comes after that? And most of them are like, what? Why would I do analytics for that? I don't need analytics to tell me how to influence a people on a given way of living or something to change whatever. I just need to provide what they need the most. Like, for example, the kids we were talking about, they want to revise. And what you can do with that data is compare maybe what happens to the kids before they were using the application and then after. So it's measuring something realistic. And that's why I have a problem with saying who is collecting the data. I would rather, I think, talk about why you're collecting the data. What is your purpose? Do you want to change whatever on paper, or do you really want to have an impact that is real? Do you want to solve a problem that is real? I don't think for those women, to be honest, they wanted to change their lives. It was just, yeah, I don't think they wanted to change their life. So for the developers, most of them look at it as solving problems as opposed to the other way. There's a traffic app that crowdsources traffic information. And people voluntarily, I use it. I really think about why. I'm like, yeah, there's traffic on Ngong Road. Let me tell people there's traffic on Ngong Road. But what that data I give to that particular person can do, I don't really think much about it. And that's maybe being a very young, being very young in this space, we don't really look at it from that broad perspective. We eventually will, but right now, very few. And that's why so many research. And I strongly believe in coordinating and collaborating with the local people in collecting such data, because then they give you the context right, as opposed to you trying to force your hypothesis to be true. Yeah.
Can I just add on that, about involving the local people? We got, paid to organize this thing, and especially to involve the local stakeholders that we have as a partner. And the challenge we had, involving the researchers, first, they say they lack knowledge. Some research lab, they say, oh, we don't have this data analyst, we don't have this programmer that we can use. And second, they lack machines, like a really powerful computer that can analyze those data. And I think if we really want to have the people to get ownership of the data and the research, you need to provide them with more skills, or at least skills and resources. Not on the very short-term help, but really build on a long-term those kind of research ecosystem. And this is very important, otherwise there's still going to be data that are owned by telco operators from the outside that are going to be analyzed by the people from the outside for the people inside, so it's not relevant.
I was just wondering, Zara, maybe you can also make that a little bit more specific, what you think has to be done in order to ensure that people have agency, have transparency, and get involved in that decision-making process. I mean, you all kind of mentioned that problem, people don't really know what is happening, they might not care, they might not be aware. There is no legal framework really, so and companies or maybe some NGOs just do it because they think they have to do it. But what can we really do? What would be specific steps to enable people to be involved in that decision-making process? What to do with data, and when, and how, and for which purpose?
Well, I feel like we're kind of splitting this up into kind of people in Africa don't know what's going on with their data, whereas as though people in other countries do. And actually, that traffic app you talked about, I think it's called Waze, and my family in Switzerland use it. There's a very similar one that's like crowdsourced data, and you have to sign up, and you do all sorts of things. And I think actually most people have no idea of where their data is going. It's just the main difference that I can see is that when we're talking about African countries, we have like European and North American companies or donors or charitable funds coming and studying. Whereas here, if people tried to do that in Europe, there'd be a massive outcry, and we'd be like, oh God, I can't believe they're treating us like that. It's this basically, there's the same level of lack of knowledge or lack of actual understanding of where your data is going. It's just, researchers come and say, oh, now we can study you, and then we can take all this stuff outside. And that, I think, it's a terrible way to be thinking about the argument, really.
If I may interject there, it just brings to mind, IBM Research set up their first Africa lab in Nairobi 2 years ago. And they came with the premise, big data and Watson would solve this key 6 African challenges that identified. None of their projects is scaling. None. 0. Niet. Nothing. And it's because the premise was already, that thing, already the premise of what they say the world is their lab, that didn't work out too well for them because context was lacking from the researchers to the hypotheses and the assumptions. What we found with the work we do, the most effective way to get people to be aware of how their data is used is to be part of a conversation and synthesize back in that conversation. So we find a conversation about ethnicity in Kenya, which is one of the drivers of hate speech. And you interject in that conversation and tell people, actually, based on a previous conversation and other previous conversations around the similar issue, this is what happened. And then people are like, oh, well, interesting that when I tweet about this, it's picked up on and is used in research. We found, well, we can write papers, we can policy briefs and that kind of thing. The best thing in terms of engaging people is giving back through conversation and spaces through which they're already engaging to generate that data, insights based on what we're finding. And that has been super interesting in getting people involved even in fighting for their own freedom online. Because it's been about saying, look, guys, we see that there's hatred being driven, but by the same context, there's so much attempt to sort of counter it. So that self-regulation mechanism is already citizen-generated. Giving back that finding has been more than enough to empower people. We haven't had to do much else. Yeah.
I mean, you all seem to agree that the purpose of the data analysis has to be more or less clear from the beginning. Like, why do you do something? Why do you make that intervention? Why do you do that research? I wonder, isn't it inherent to big data analytics that very often you don't know what you will find, and that the correlation will just kind of come up, with a kind of open data set. You work with it, and then you discover something terribly interesting, which might have a huge social implication. But you haven't really been thinking about it from the very beginning, because had you wouldn't have had to do the data analysis, you know what I mean? Isn't that a dilemma?
Yeah, I completely agree with that, because when we organized the launch of this D40 challenge in Senegal, you had all the researchers that had no idea what to do with that. And as soon as you start talking, organizing group session on specific topic, they say, oh, maybe we can do that and do that. So it's an entire process to have the people really thinking about what they could do for their own context. And it takes an entire day and several workshops after that to make the people work together, create teams, and after, propose a research project. And of course, after you have the idea of the project, but you also have the result. Are you able to really use this data to prove what you would like to prove? And that's also another challenge sometimes.
Thank you, Jan. Sorry, Sheila, before you may just reply in a second. I just want to invite our audience. We only have a couple of minutes left, but if someone has a comment or a question, feel free. We do have a microphone in the room. So, yeah, should we do the question? Is that okay? Yes, over there, the gentleman on the right. Over there.
Check, check, check. Yes. I have a question. I mean, we talk about the privacy issues of data, and it's a bit of a hard sell in the development context when people are dying from whatever diseases and so on. So I guess if you when you try to get the debate going, Zara, for example, what are your most prominent examples that you would mention? I mean, you mentioned the Syrian refugee in Turkey that might have his life threatened by being biometrically identified, or are there other kind of like examples that make the case also for the development community?
I think in terms of examples, there shouldn't really need to be anything more said than privacy is a human right. Like that's it. Like you can try and think of as many examples of how this might go terribly, terribly wrong, but if you can't respect that everyone is a human being, and if you're working in development and you can't understand that everyone deserves to be treated in the same way, you probably shouldn't be working in development. You can do that, I can't. No.
Okay. Yes.
Oh. So I wondered if any of you could just speak to the question of, like, it seems to me that sometimes it's almost like a solution in search of a problem, or people who do this kind of data science are like, I could do this with anything, but I want to do it on poor people, and that's their interest. And I guess I've noticed also that a lot of the projects actually, maybe they're tied to an academic institution, but maybe they're not. And when they're not, there's often not an ethics review process or an IRB process, which even in some universities that doesn't exist, but that should there be more of a sort of set of questions that researchers need to consider before they just drop into Kibera and start following people around trying to get water, whatever.
Yeah. I mean, we discussed that before, that how can we kind of have a more of an ethical debate in research, but also for these projects. Jan, you mentioned to me, you have an external advisory board.
I feel like you should answer it.
See, the Kibera example will be remembered. I'll go look for the paper and share it around. No, I mean, that's a valid question, and I think this goes back to each individual country context and the perception they have about how outsiders come into your country and do stuff. You find, I think in Kenya, the whole process of how the IRB is not very clear. I mean, it's not this strict thing that you must go through. But the onus on that is on Kenyan institutions, and especially the Kenyan academia, to sort of enforce that and make it a sort of like a manifesto that, these are the guiding principles. Do not look at people as this helpless. And I think this is something ourselves we have to sort of project back to the world, as opposed to always complaining about how you're doing it wrong. And I'll take that 100%. So, I mean, I think it's a question of each country and each context taking that up and making it their own thing, and a guideline that they project out there.
Yeah, ethics in science, it's a huge topic. I mean, you can have whatever process at the university level, it always goes back to the individual and what they really want to achieve. And I think in this case, what they've been doing well is creating outside of the program a very independent ethic committee with 15 people from the scientific, whatever type of background, who are going to review if all of the paper and the research that has been done is relevant and ethics. And I think this is the type of thing we should do, and maybe that's not enough, and we should do way more. But that's one part. But after, it's ethics, it's also a lot of education. We have to make sure the people in those universities, they understand better the local context, as they understand what are the needs. So maybe it's more collaboration before the project or even during the project. And maybe, using the diaspora connection, it could be huge. Maybe to apply for such kind of project, you have to have a scientist from the diaspora or from the country. Maybe you can create rules like that. That could really facilitate this, the relevance of the project, maybe. I don't know if that answers.
Does it? Okay. Happy audience. Yes.
Hello? Yeah, I think it's me.
Oh, sorry. Gentleman in the first row.
Well, it's a fascinating debate, but it's not a new debate. I mean, we could be talking about genetically modified. I mean, we're talking about something I mean, I was born in Benin. I live in Benin. I live in the US. In the US, I have a social security number. I mean, I feel like in the US, in Europe, I am not protected. I mean, it's the same problem. I mean, when I do a Google search or whatever I do, I mean, normally government should protect me, but the NSA knows more about me than Google does. So, I mean, I don't think that anyone is right or wrong. I feel like it's just a topic that is going to kind of solve itself, just like any other things that we're involved in. Because, I mean, if I think of Zara's point, I mean, I totally agree with you that there is an issue. But at the same time, as a researcher, as a business person, and knowing the fact that data is not available in Africa, and that is one of the key things, I want to be able to first to gather, to collect data. I want to be able to analyze data. But I do understand what you were saying. So you said it's not like you are not advocating innovation, but innovation is messy. Like, innovation is something that you can't really, there are people doing cloning, but at the same time, yeah, I mean, you just don't know them, but I mean, if it's possible, people are doing cloning. But at the same time, you know, stem cells and all these things, it's messy, you know. And so my issue is, you're all right and kind of a little wrong a little bit.
Well, that sounds a little bit like scientific determinism. I mean, it will happen anyway, and well, I mean, would you share that view?
Just context. I think we'll just summarize the word context. Everything in context just makes it more closer to helping us figure out what the hell we're trying to figure out. Yeah, this parachute data analysis is kind of like parachute journalism. You know, you drop in, drop out. It's not going to work.
I want to just touch about innovation, and I think just about the last slide I had, I think if we have also too much data in data research, we're not going to go anywhere. We're just going to replicate what we hope to see and what we want to see. And researchers, you know, when they use those data, they already have in mind what they want to say with this data. So they use the data saying, oh, it's going to tell that. Whereas maybe what we need is the other thing that nobody knows, the disruptive innovation, disruptive research. And that's really my concern, you know, especially supporting tech startups. We don't expect startups to do something, you know, that is just replicating what we had in Europe or in the US 10 years ago. And that works, even if the consumer is going to buy on internet, all this kind of thing. Okay, that's going to make good business maybe. But if we really want to catch up in some way, we need like amazing things that we cannot predict. And I think data is going to be very bad at that, because they're going to help us, you know, just predict the short-term future and not having this disruptive technology. Just think about Tesla, for instance. Is there any way you could have data analysis to predict, oh, we should do battery for the car or this kind of thing? Even SpaceX. No, can you predict that?
Can round it up.
So I don't want to take too long on that, but I really this is the thing for me that I want to keep in mind when I use data and when I do data projects.
Okay, thank you, Jan.
Yeah.
Sheila.
For me, it's simple. Before we even start talking about ownership of big data, we need data. And in developing countries, our data is manual. So the fact that we are talking about digital data, we are talking about a very small, very tiny percentage of the real data. That's all.
Thank you so much, Sheila, for putting everything into perspective at the end of this wonderful panel. And please help me thanking our distinguished panelists.